In Essential Task 8.5a, we are going to begin a sequence of 3 essential tasks, 8.5a, b, and c, which looks at the central nervous system, and more specifically in A and B, the brain. We are going to talk both about interior regions of the brain, like the thalamus, but also exterior regions of the cerebral cortex, the wrinkly part of the brain that often comes to mind when you think of the brain, like the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe, and a variety of other regions. This essential task is broken down into 3 categories because, unfortunately, the nervous system, and specifically the central nervous system here on the left, it just has a lot going on. There are simply just a lot of various regions of the brain that we have to talk about. So I'm going to try and simplify it and break it down into differing essential tasks to make it so that each of these fit on approximately 1 piece of paper each. Today we're going to define the central nervous system. So it's this box here at the top. And then the primary region of the concept map today, looking here at the Prezi, is the brain stem and cerebellum, which are 3 boxes, the thalamus, which is 1 box, and then the limbic system, which is 4 more boxes. It looks a little bit longer because of the giant pictures that I have here at the top, but this secondary level is really only 3, 1, and then 4, so 8 total boxes here on that secondary level. Also, you would take the central nervous system box here at the top and position it approximately here. So you should have the central nervous system at the top of your page, overarching the secondary level of 8 total boxes. In 8.5b, we'll transition to the corpus callosum and the cerebral cortex. And then in 8.5c, we'll talk about just the spinal cord in a singular box concept map. So the central nervous system, although it looks like a considerable amount, is actually 3 concept maps worth of information. Though, as a whole, still one of the longer topics this year. I will return now to the task text to allow you to copy down the portion in yellow before proceeding into the concept map. We'll start just by defining the central nervous system. So as we'll talk about the nervous system, that term can be broken down into the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system. The essential tasks 8.5a, b, and c all focus on the central nervous system, which is very simply defined as the brain and spinal cord, nothing else. So the neural connections and the neurons that are active in the brain and the spinal cord, interneurons, for example, in the spinal cord, all comprise your central nervous system. Everything else, the neurons in your arms and legs, for example, all comprise the peripheral nervous system. And again, we'll talk about that in its own essential task later in this unit. But for today, we're going to talk exclusively about the brain element of the central nervous system. That will also then be the topic in 8.5b. The spinal cord will be a singular box for an 8.5c concept map. In terms of the brain, we're going to start on the interior regions of the brain, at least partially. The brainstem, which is a little bit less interior, but then definitely some interior regions with the thalamus and limbic system. We'll start with the first category. So I'm going to try and group these logically. Relatively speaking, that might mean based on locations, but it might also mean on relationships to one another. The limbic system, for example, the furthest to the right has some connections to one another from location to location. But we'll first start all the way on the left with the brainstem and cerebellum. The brainstem and cerebellum would be this region here that's highlighted in this pink, but then also what looks like almost a small secondary brain here in the back. The first region is called the pons and reticular formation. They're actually technically 2 separate regions. I do just group them together, though, because I think they have such a similar functionality that any question where pons is the answer, you could equally answer that question with reticular formation. And as a result, I simply just group these 2 together because of their similar functionality. So regardless of which one we're talking about, the pons and reticular formation are partially responsible for the regulation of arousal and alertness. You could conceivably also connect specifically the pons with dreaming. There seems to be a lot of brain activity in the pons when somebody is dreaming. Why that happens to be, and if that's the precise location of how dreams occur, that's a little bit up for debate, but nevertheless, there is some possibility there. If you were to damage either of these regions, it's pretty conceivable that you would go into a coma. One of the most common types of questions that you see in this unit is what would happen if this region were damaged. So it's important not only to know the functionality, but also what a common brain injury could produce. In terms of the diagram that you're looking at, the pons is indicated here. It's actually this sort of larger oval. So if you look at the zoomed out view, not the zoomed in one here at the bottom left, it would be what almost looks like this egg shape here. The reticular formation is a bundle of neurons that kind of extends through the brainstem, which is what I've tried to indicate here with this blue. So they are 2 quite separate things, but they both have very similar functionality. So I always group together the pons and reticular formation. As a mnemonic, when I look at the word reticular, the T-I-C-U-L in the middle kind of reminds me of the word tickle. It kind of even sounds like that. I don't know about you, but if I was tickled, I'd get really alert really quickly. That alertness would at least partially be produced by activity in the reticular formation or pons. Proceeding onward is arguably one of the most important regions of your brain. Not that all regions of your brain don't have some degree of importance, but if you were to damage your medulla, it would very quickly produce catastrophic, probably lethal consequences. Your medulla is responsible for controlling automatic vital functioning, things that you don't have to sit there and think about, things that just sort of happen behind the scenes. I'm talking about maintaining a heartbeat. I'm talking about swallowing when you're eating food. I'm talking about breathing. If you were to damage your medulla, you would very quickly die. If this were an FRQ bullet, I mean, you could even be that dramatic. If it asks, how does the medulla help, or how could damage to the medulla hurt? You could go straight to the point and say damage to the medulla would make it such that you could no longer control your breathing and you would very soon after die. So the medulla facilitates the neural impulses necessary to maintain those automatic functions that are happening behind the scenes. As a mnemonic, I like to look at the word medulla and think of metal, and I think of the idea of a gold medal. If you were to wear a gold medal around your neck, the actual gold medal portion would be right in front of your chest. The reason why that's useful is your chest is the house to your lungs and, at least to a certain degree, your heart. The fact that your lungs and your heart are positioned right where a gold medal would be located if you were to wear it around your neck is vital to me because it connects with the breathing and the heartbeat element of the medulla's automatic functionality. So I think you can very easily look at the word medulla, connect it with metal, and then use that as a pretty sufficient mnemonic. Continuing in to the final is the cerebellum. So technically, if you look at this diagram, this little almost secondary tiny brain in the back is actually the back of your head. So this is the front of your head here in the diagram. This portion back here is the back of your head. So the cerebellum here is located all the way in the back of your head. And activity in the cerebellum is responsible for smooth, coordinated, voluntary movement, and then also balance. So for example, when you're typing, the ability to type nice and smooth, the ability to actually type coherent words because your fingers are in their proper locations is facilitated by the cerebellum. If you grab your phone and start texting, the nice, smooth, crisp movements that you're doing, facilitated by the cerebellum. It's also responsible for overall balance. So if you were to stand on one leg, there would be a ton of activity in your cerebellum. We can denote damage to the cerebellum because someone would be walking and they would sort of be tipping over to one side. That would indicate damage to the cerebellum. When we look at the word cerebellum, to me, the word bell stands out. The reason why I think that's a useful mnemonic is if you were to balance on a bell, so if you were to one leg balance on a bell, you would need considerable functionality of your cerebellum. When we come back into the last unit, we're going to talk about sensation. There is a sense that's directly related to balancing and body position. We will see then when we talk about the vestibular sense, that the vestibular sense and the receptors for the vestibular sense actually send information to the cerebellum for processing. So we will make a future connection with the cerebellum when we talk about sensation. But a little bit of a preview of that if you've ever heard of the vestibular sense. But simply put, how does the cerebellum help? Smooth, crisp, voluntary movement. Walking, running, typing, bike riding, turning the wheel of a car. How is this going to help you play an instrument? It's going to make sure your hands are properly aligned and smoothly moving so you can play the instrument. I mean, there's a ton of examples. Zooming back out, we're now going to go to the singular region of the brain called the thalamus. The thalamus is basically positioned right above the brainstem, but it's not going to be considered part of the limbic system, the region to the right. So we're going to talk about it in isolation. The thalamus has an interesting role. The thalamus is in many ways what I like to call the sensory hub in your brain. And what that means is incoming sensory information about all of your senses except smell go first to the thalamus before they are sent to the regions of what is called your cerebral cortex for final processing. Your cerebral cortex is the wrinkly outside part of your brain. And as we'll talk about in the next essential task, there is a region of your cerebral cortex with a corresponding lobe for your major senses. So you have lobes for hearing, you have lobes for vision, you have lobes for vision, you have lobes for other functionality related to your senses. Well, incoming sensory information, for example, like what it is that you're seeing, before it actually gets to the cerebral cortex for final processing, is sent to a region of the brain called the thalamus, which means damage to the thalamus could actually affect more than one sense. You know, there are some injuries where somebody stops some degree of their hearing. Their hearing starts to go, their vision starts to go, and you're curious, why are two senses being affected? Well, when two senses or three senses are being affected, we can be more confident that there's some issue at the thalamus. If only one sense was deficient, we could pinpoint that to damage of the cerebral cortex in the part of the cerebral cortex associated with that one sense. But when it's multiple senses, it's more conceivable that there's actually damage in the thalamus. So the only sense that this doesn't function with is smell. We'll talk more about smell when we actually get to our unit on the senses. I'll tell you all about our brain region associated with smell, the olfactory bulb. But for now, the thalamus is responsible for taking sensory information. So what it is that you see, what it is that you hear, what it is that you're feeling, and sending that to the cerebral cortex, the wrinkly part of your brain, where it will be processed at the final point. Again, we'll talk about the cerebral cortex and those lobes in the next task. As a mnemonic, when I look at the word thalamus, I take the first and the last letter, and I think of the phrase the senses. If you see thalamus and think of the senses, T and thalamus for T and the, S for senses, S at the end of the word thalamus, you just kind of eliminate the middle part of the word and think of the senses. You should be able to answer the questions properly. But the last one is the limbic system, which you can see here with the yellow portion of the diagram. The limbic system actually is a term that we use to summarize or describe three separate regions of the brain that we're going to talk about in just a moment: the amygdala, hypothalamus, and hippocampus. We actually already talked about two of these this year, but I'll bring that up when we actually get to their boxes. The reason why we group them together and the reason why there's a term like the limbic system to describe the connection between each of these regions is that some of these regions, like for example, the amygdala and the hippocampus, their functionality can be quite intertwined. As we'll see in just a moment, the amygdala is responsible for emotions, things like fear. The hippocampus, as we might recall from Unit 1, is responsible for the formation of long-term memory. There is a reason why really traumatic emotional events are so well etched into our long-term memory, and it can partially be due to the fact that the limbic system and the neural pathways associated with emotion and memory are so closely intertwined. But nevertheless, the limbic system as a big picture is responsible for memory, emotion, and motivation. Those sort of summarize the three separate regions below. And now we'll go through each of these regions to ensure that we can differentiate them. Because oftentimes, quite frankly, you'll actually see them separated on the AP exam. It's not inconceivable to see the word limbic system, but it's very common just to see the word amygdala as well. The term amygdala is a term we use for a region of the brain that essentially connects to all elements of our emotion. So that can be our individual personal emotion on any given day, but it also can do things such as help evaluate and interpret facial expressions. So, for example, there are facial expressions that are designed to give off the impression of being threatening. Well, the amygdala can help you evaluate and adjust accordingly if somebody is expressing a facial expression that is in and of itself threatening. There's also going to be a ton of activity in the amygdala when trying to perceive threats in our environment and facilitate the fight or flight response. The amygdala can contribute to acts of aggression or can contribute to fear depending on what this threat is. If somebody is giving off a threatening facial expression, there's going to be a ton of activity in the amygdala determining, am I going to fight this person? Am I going to walk away from this person? Am I afraid of this person? Is this going to produce aggression in my own behavior? Your amygdala as a whole has a direct connection to overall emotion regulation, but that also can be seen, as I just alluded to, in terms of things like perceiving threats in your environment. Damage to the amygdala really could do one of two things. It could make an organism hyper-aggressive, almost turn off their ability to regulate if a threat is actually threatening, make them almost seemingly fearless. It can also make you sort of recoil and exhibit a great deal of fear. So it can go in either direction. It sort of depends on what element of the amygdala is affected. I would like you to watch these two very short clips at the bottom left here, or at least to the left side of the concept map. In these two clips, you are going to see a rat go into a confined area where there is a robotic, much larger device representing a mouse at their other side. The question is whether or not the animal, the organism, is going to cross through to get food in the face of this clearly threatening machine-like device that's quite considerably larger. In the first clip, we see an organism with a functional amygdala, and you'll notice once the device exhibits a degree of threat, once the device pushes forward, the animal retracts immediately. Their amygdala responds accordingly. They realize they're in the midst of a bad situation. Their fight or flight response kicks in, and they leave. The second, though, is what happens if we turn off amygdala functionality. So we strap on the device, we turn off amygdala activation. So now we're talking about an animal that has no sensor, no processing for whether or not he or she is in a threatening situation. You'll notice that animal will go right up and get the food and walk out. It's no longer afraid, no longer exhibiting that fear in response to this quite considerably larger threatening device. So I think it is fascinating to see what happens when we essentially turn off the amygdala. You'll see that type of multiple choice question on the AP exam quite frequently, alluding to studies like the ones indicated on the left. As a mnemonic, I always look at this and I see the word Amy and I see that letter G and I always think of Amy who is angry, or angry Amy. If you connect anger to this, you're connecting an emotion, and then hopefully you'll be able to summarize this by just looking at Amy, thinking she's angry, and that works. Or you can look at A and think of aggression, or A and think of anger. Whether it's aggression or this Amy who's angry, if you look at that letter A and really harness the idea of aggression or anger, you should be able to connect the connection to emotion. The last two regions that we actually already talked about this year, but I'm going to add a little bit more depth relative to the previous time that we talked about them, at least specifically with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus was a region of the brain we brought up when we talked about motivation, because it is the region of the brain that becomes stimulated to trigger hunger. It also becomes stimulated to alert your body that you're satisfied or that you're full. So it's what I like to call responsible for maintenance activities. So it influences hunger, as we talked about. It also influences thirst. So eating and drinking are two elements of sort of maintenance activities that we need in order to survive. There's also activity in the hypothalamus related to the sex drive. As we'll see in just a few moments, the hypothalamus is closely linked to our hormone regulation, and as a result, sex drive has a close linkage to hormone levels. There's also a connection between overall body temperature and regulating whether or not you're hot or cold, and what your body can do accordingly to return back to a nice equilibrium temperature. And then although the hypothalamus is part of the brain, it is closely linked and is often considered part of what's called the endocrine system. The endocrine system is a topic that gets its own essential task later in this unit, but the endocrine system is a term that we use to group together all of the glands in our body. Glands function like the sex glands, or like the pituitary gland, or like your adrenal glands. The glands function through hormones. So when we talk about hormones like testosterone or estrogen or melatonin or adrenaline or growth hormone, those are all released into the bloodstream as part of the endocrine system's functionality. While the hypothalamus is in many ways the linkage between your body's hormone regulation and then your body's overall brain functionality. So there is a strong connection between those two. As a mnemonic, when I look at the word hypothalamus, I try to isolate the H and the Y at the beginning, and I always think of hunger or hungry. Although there are quite a few other maintenance activities like thirst, the sex drive, body temperature, and just hormone regulation as a whole, if you connect hunger, you're at least getting partially one of the functions of the hypothalamus. And in perfect world, if this is an FRQ bullet, if you write about hunger, that should be sufficient enough to score. So it at least gives you one of several elements. But if you think of hunger, that might also help you connect with other biological necessities that I classify as maintenance activities like thirst, the sex drive, and body temperature. The last one in the conclusion of our concept map today is a flashback to Unit 1. This may have been the exact box that I used in Unit 1. But if you recall Clive Waring, no pun intended, back in Unit 1, he was the gentleman who was a world-renowned pianist and musician who seemingly lost the ability to form long-term memory. He also seemingly lost a considerable degree of his long-term memory, of course, except the recollection of his wife, Deborah. The hippocampus was the region of the brain that Clive injured. The hippocampus is responsible for taking short-term memories and transferring them into long-term memories. So if you recall the videos that we saw with Clive, he could basically live within that 20 to 30 second window of time that we called short-term memory. So he could partially converse with you if the information that he was conversing about was within a 20 to 30 second window. But the second that that information expanded beyond 20 to 30 seconds, he would be unable to take that short-term memory information, transfer it into long-term, and therefore would often have conversations virtually every time he conversed that were just highly repetitive because none of the information was ever making it to long-term memory. His hippocampus had been deteriorated as a result of a brain injury. As a mnemonic, and this was the same mnemonic that I offered back in Unit 1, I see the word hippocampus, I see the word campus, and I think of school. You don't often use that term to talk about a high school campus, though you can. You'll end up using the word campus way more when you're talking about a college campus. There's dorms, there's classes all over the place, dining halls, etc. So when I see that word campus, I always think of college campuses. The reason that's a useful mnemonic is if you connect memory with school, as you often probably could do, that mnemonic can be sufficient to identify the key and primary function of the hippocampus.